All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Code PaLOUsa, and specifically single page application architectures with Vue.js and ASP.NET Core. My name is Kevin Griffin. I am so glad you're here with me today. Come on, you piece of crap. All right. These things only work well when you have focus on the PowerPoint. All right. For those who don't know me, my name is Kevin Griffin. I'm 11-time Microsoft MVP focused in ASP.NET Core and Azure. I live in Chesapeake, Virginia, which no one's probably ever heard of, but it's been voted one of the top 3 most boring cities in the country. And I wear that pretty proudly. But if you're looking for a closer city that actually means something to someone, I live near Norfolk, Virginia, which is the home to the world's largest naval base. If for any reason you want to talk to me afterwards, Twitter is usually the best way. I also do a somewhat regular Twitch stream at 1KevGriff, and I'll also throw my email and my website up here if for any reason you want to reach out afterwards. Now, normally with these sort of talks, people ask, Kevin, where can I get the resources? Do you have slides? Do you have replays? Do you have anything special that you can add? And the answer is yes. If you go to consultwithgriff.com/spas with Vue.js, ASP.NET Core, and I'll make sure this gets into the chat a little bit later. This will have all the resources for this particular talk. So if you miss this and something messes up with the recording, you can still get to the resources. So I love talking about history. I've been a web developer on the .NET platform for much longer than I care to admit, but I'm probably not as old as a lot of people that watch this sort of talk. My introduction to web development was with ASP.NET Web Forms. And I think a lot of you who are web developers nowadays probably started around the same time, where everything we did were controls. So click and drag. If you had to go over to the code view, you were somewhat special. But we did a lot of work in these web forms and wrote very little JavaScript. If there was JavaScript, it was implied JavaScript, or you would write little JavaScript snippets and add them to the different controls. So as we were building these apps, things progressed, the world moved on, and we kind of found out that web forms was really limiting in the type of things that we wanted to do as web professionals. So one day on a plane, the story goes, Scott Guthrie wrote ASP.NET MVC, and we got Razor, or so now Razor Pages, but we got Razor syntax, which got us closer to the metal in a web browser. So we could just write HTML, and then we could inject little bits of C# wherever we needed to, which was kind of the opposite of web forms, where web forms was mostly C#, and then we sprinkled in a little bit of HTML. And then we have moved on even further, and I don't see folks nowadays writing as much Razor as they used to. We have moved more as an industry towards just writing raw HTML and decorating things with JavaScript and building these really robust client experiences that talk to services versus the formal post back to the server to get a new rendering of the page. So that's kind of the history of client-side applications in the .NET ecosystems. But there have been lots of advances in terms of building client-side apps. And so if you're here, you probably have heard of one of these 3 application frameworks. So we have React, we have Angular, we have Vue. And I have written production applications in all 3, or if you count every version of Angular, all 15, I'm kidding, versions of these frameworks. And I am a super opinionated person. If you talk to me on Twitter, if you come to my Twitch stream, I just kind of like to drop my opinions, but they're hard-earned opinions. I have kind of settled on Vue.js as my favorite thing to write client-side applications in. And I really don't have the time nor patience to go into all the issues I've had with Angular and with React. But Vue tends to solve most of my problems. And even though this talk is labeled Vue.js Single Page Applications, the lessons I'm going to throw down today really apply to any of these 3 stacks. So if you're not a Vue person, that's fine. I would love to convert you, but if you're still doing React or you're doing Angular, these lessons carry over no problem. The big thing that we have to learn is that by adopting one of these frameworks, we're thinking of a new way. It's a new way of thinking of building client-side applications. Whereas in the past, Razor, web forms, we started with the .NET implementation. So let's say a Razor page, and then we would inject little bits of functionality. But it was all in this realm of the .NET application. Nowadays, we're not thinking about it that way. We need to think of them as two separate applications. Vue, Angular, and React all provide CLIs or command line interfaces for bootstrapping and developing these particular types of apps. Our development cycles and our deployment cycles happen outside of the .NET app or the services app. So we treat them really as their own fundamental thing. The front end, so we're writing a VueJS app and we build all the bits and pieces that it might need data, but it shouldn't care where the data comes from because that's not a core focus of the client side. All the client is going to do is make calls to an API of such and say, I need data, I need data, I need data. And it doesn't matter where it's getting that data from as long as data is returned. Oh, and I got my my bullets backwards. So the front end doesn't care where it's served from. Traditionally, with Razor, you had to go render the Razor page to get the data in the browser. Well, nowadays, these client apps are just their own fundamental thing. So they could be served from a .ASP.NET application. They could be served from an Azure static site. They could be served from blob storage out of Azure. It doesn't matter where it's getting served from. It's just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And everything else happens after it's loaded into the browser. So I've been building these sort of apps for a couple of years now. As I said, I've written Angular, React, and now Vue. And I keep asking myself, how do I build a better framework for me to develop these sorts of applications where I have .NET-based backends and I have HTML, JavaScript-based front ends. So that's kind of where this talk came from, because I've learned a couple lessons, and that's what I want to talk about today. My goals for this talk, if you don't get anything else out of it, I want to talk about my approach for building spas with Vue.js and ASP.NET Core. My approach. The reason it's my approach is this is what's worked well for me. I've tried a lot of different things. It's not the only approach out there. And I really encourage you to look at other approaches as well, because that's how you find your niche. Is you find something that works well for you and you stick with that. I did this before as more of a tutorial, start from A and then work my way up to F. Well, turns out I can lose a bunch of people through that step of the process. So I took a step back it was December last year, and I rewrote this entire talk to be question answer based. So I looked at the common questions I was getting from people, and I will just do question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. And hopefully that explains the process a little bit better. I also use a couple different libraries in this talk, and I want to explain why I use certain libraries instead of just telling you, use this, use that, and then moving on. I don't think that's helpful for anyone. Things you will not learn in this talk. I'm not going to teach you everything about Vue. That is a workshop all on its own. Vue, I think, fundamentally is easier to learn than both React and Angular. There's fewer moving parts. You can get to Hello World a little bit quicker. That has just been my experience. I sadly can't teach you everything you need to know about Vue. If you already have a working knowledge of Vue, this is going to be a much easier talk for you. But if you don't, that's okay. I'm going to teach you enough that you need to know to at least get started. You don't need to know everything about ASP.NET Core. I Core in particular, because if you're writing, full framework ASP.NET for greenfield applications, I'm sorry, you need to have a talk with the boss. Don't do that. All the examples I give should kind of build on top of each other and get us to an end product. If not, there's always question and answer at the end. All right. Let's imagine we've built out an entire single page application, front end, back end. What does that look like from a 10,000 foot view? Well, first we have our API, our ASP.NET Core application. I just call this the backend, and it's responsible for a couple core things. Data access, so it's going to be our conduit to a database, whether it's SQL, NoSQL, blob storage, table storage, queues, caching, data. It's also going to be responsible for authentication and authorization. So, of course, I do an online event and the phone rings. So authentication and authorization. Can I access the data? Can I access the resources? And so that's step one. Here's who I am. And am I allowed into the system? And then for individual things, am I allowed to perform those actions? That's authorization. Am I allowed to delete all the users from the database? Probably not. So that's where the authorization comes in. The client, the backend should never trust anything that comes from the client. It should validate. But it lives as its own separate thing. And then over on the front end, we have our VueJS application, and that's responsible for its own core topics. First is routing. So single page application, you're going to have multiple views, multiple levels of state. How does all that get managed? Well, there's a routing engine built into Vue.js that you can use. Does all that work? State management. So there's a couple different ways to do state in Vue.js. You can do it at a component level, or you can use something like Vuex, which is more of a global level. And then data fetching. When you download a Vue.js application, a single page application, it's just the bones. It's the HTML, it's the JavaScript, it's the CSS. There's no data along with it. That data is retrieved from the ASP.NET Core backend. So we need some mechanism to go fetch that data. You could just use the built-in browser fetch options. That's part of the spec now. Should be in all current generation browsers. And it's hit or miss for me. I really like Axios. So I'll talk about Axios as a Ajax library that you could use. So let's dive into a couple questions. And let me check out chat. Rob Richardson, what's your favorite material design framework that's compatible with Vue 3? So Vuetify is the library for material design. I use Vuetify for a couple different projects, and it should be compatible with Vue 3 now, because they usually work hand in hand. I'm not quite sure about that. But yeah, if I was going to do anything with material, I would use Vuetify because it's an amazing framework. All right. Question number one, what do I need to know about Vue to even get started on this process? All right. Vue.js is a framework for building client-side applications. Done. Everyone go home. Vue is based on components. And this is very similar to the other libraries out there. A component in Vue, this is a single file component. 95% of the stuff you write in Vue look just like this. You have a little snippet of HTML that you can style and you can write a little bit of code for. And this lives as its own thing in a Vue.js architecture. But I can go in and I can add more and more logic to this. So I can add properties, I can add methods, I can add local state for data. I can add events. So like, well, if you click on this or click on that, something happens. There's a lot more to a component than what's here in 21 lines. But at its fundamental level, you have components, and this component has a child component that does something else. And these components basically build a tree of functionality within your application. I already covered all this. Template styles, their state properties and events. That's Vue. And then we just compose all these things together. When you use something like Angular, and I'll use Angular in particular, React is the same way. There's a lot of opinion on how things should be done. Like functionality will or will not exist based off the opinion of the framework. For example, React doesn't have a concept of a repeating component. There's no Like Angular has ng repeat, Vue has v repeat, whatever it is in Vue. I'm lapsing now, but like React doesn't have the concept of a for each loop for components. And that's because they have an opinion on how that sort of thing should be done in the terms of their virtual DOM. And that's fine. What I like about Vue is limited opinion. It's HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. You put those together, you get an application. It does the stuff that it does have an opinion on very well, but leaves it mostly up to you. So there's no HTTP library built into it like Angular. There's no real common sense of dependency injection like Angular. You just use what you want to use for different things. You don't have the opinion of the framework. How do you set up a VueJS application? This is V4. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'm sitting there lapsing on it because I've used all these frameworks, and it always takes me a second to remember, oh, right, how does Vue does this thing? All right. So how do you set up a VueJS application? We go to the command line. So command line, npm install, yarn install. Anyone out there using yarn? I have not made the jump, and I feel like I should. But you install the Vue CLI. And from the Vue CLI, you asked the question, why the Vue CLI? Well, I have some hard-earned experience here. You don't have to use the CLI. Unlike like some complex React or Angular apps, you need to bootstrap that sucker in order to make it useful. Vue, my Hello World example for Vue is dropping in a JavaScript file and writing a little bit of code. It's like I was writing jQuery 10 years ago. 15 years ago. I would drop in jQuery and then write a little bit of code against it. Vue can work exactly the same way. But for building a more robust application, the CLI helps tremendously just getting some of that ceremony designed and built out. So I highly recommend using the CLI. Hot reload is really cool. So as you're building and you edit a file, it'll detect the changes, hot reload what's in the browser, and you're always looking at the current version of the code. This one's bolded. Upgrading. So currently we're running Vue version 2 point something. Vue 3 is right around the corner. When you make these major jumps in versions, trying to upgrade all the dependencies is really cumbersome. And let me go back to my initial React experience. I built an app with React using the CLI, got all the scaffold done. And about a month into it, I went, you know what? I'm smarter than the CLI. Let me eject from the CLI scaffold. So what it does is it builds out all the configuration files for you and makes it this own little unit. And you can do all the upgrades and stuff manually. Oh my gosh, that was a pain in the butt. What happened to us was we could upgrade individually until there was a major update to React. And major update to React, you had to upgrade Webpack. I don't know if anyone out there has ever upgraded Webpack before, like major version to major version. It is actually impossible to do. We tried for like 2 weeks to upgrade Webpack so we could upgrade React, and we kept hitting walls because all of the different things that Webpack relies on to do its job, we hit this wall and went, screw it. We were just stuck at this version of React. And we moved on from there, never upgrading React, and then came back around a year or two later and said, okay, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. We ended up taking our React code, putting it back into the scaffold, the CLI project, so we could get something that could upgrade easily. That was a 2 or 3 week project, making sure everything still worked the same, running through all of our tests. It was a pain in the butt. So now my working advice is to never eject from the CLI. Use the CLI for everything, because just yesterday I did there was a Vue upgrade. I just said Vue upgrade, and it handled it all for me. And it runs through all the migrations, and it's great and easy to use. So use the CLI. When you're bootstrapping an app, it's pretty straightforward. Vue creates, give it a name, and you run through your presets. So everything that you want to add to your application, This is a very simple app. If I want Babel to handle older browser support, I could do that. I could add in TypeScript, which will give me an entire TypeScript scaffold. If I want PWAs, I can add that. Vue Router, Vuex for state management. If I want any sort of linting, if I want EDE testing with Cypress, it'll install that as well. You can basically choose your recipe for what your app should look like, and it will set it up all automatically. Set your linting. So I usually just do error prevention. And yeah, lint on save. So when you run your CLI before the hot reload, it lints your entire application, make sure everything's good. And I put things in dedicated configuration files because I always find out after the fact when I start working on an app, I need to make a slight change to Babel to support a particular feature because we have a customer who's running IE11. So I can go in the Babel and I can make those adjustments. Just easier in dedicated config files versus the package.json. You wait. This is why I don't do this demo live. This will take anywhere between 2 to 10 minutes, depending on my internet. So installing CLI plugins, it might take a while. And when you're all done, you have this scaffold that's ready to go. And you can go run npm serve, run serve, and it generates a development build of your application and creates a web server for it. So localhost, some port. Usually it's 8080, or sometimes it's 8081 if you have something else using that port. But this is a full development version of your app. So it's automatically, it's not doing like production builds, but it's giving you the JavaScript, HTML, CSS, all that with source maps so you can actually read the code in your browser. But it's all development based. So what we do is we load this up and then we just start tearing things out. We start putting our own stuff in. This is the great starting point for a basic Vue.js app. But it's only one half of the equation. Let's talk about ASP.NET Core, which is a much simpler startup experience. .NET New. Done. Almost. So you create your new .NET web app. I use New Web, which is just an empty ASP.NET Core application that doesn't do anything. It has all the ASP.NET bits in it, but it doesn't have support for controllers turned on, anything. It is just bare bones. That's where I usually like to start. The important thing is that these are two completely separate applications. The front end is your Vue.js app, and the back end is your ASP.NET Core app. Now let's talk a little bit about how spas work in Vue.js. So how does a Vue.js spa work? When you load a Vue.js spa, you're really delivering just one HTML file. It's index.html. It looks just like this. There's the common HTML stuff you see. You have this div at the bottom that's just called ID of app. And then what Vue will do during development or during a full production build is it's going to fill in some blanks. So where it says build files will be auto-injected, depending on how big or small your application is. That section will get filled up with different scripts that get pulled in either at initial load time or they get pulled in later asynchronously. But you start with just one index. All the other HTML and stuff that gets rendered on the page, those are going to come in through JavaScript files that get built during your production build. The actual spa itself is going to live inside of that div app. So you have the app, and then inside of it, you have this thing called a slot. And this is kind of just single page application 101. As the URL changes, you're defining different routes or different states of the app. And when the URL changes from one path to a different path, that slot is going to change from one thing to another thing. So what we do is we need to go in and define all the different routes that are in our application and what components in Vue should be used when a certain route applies. which is the next question. How do you do that in Vue? How do you tell Vue what components to use for different routes? Well, there's a component of Vue called the Vue router, and the Vue router does exactly this. Let's define some routes in Vue.js, and this is usually easier for me to talk to in person. But so lines 1 through 3, we're just bringing in the dependencies that we need. Line number 3 is most important because we're pulling in individual Vue components. Remember that single file component I showed a little bit earlier? That's what I'm bringing in right here. So I bring in that components. I can bring in multiple components. And then I set up a route definition. And if you've built route definitions in ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core, or any other platform, they all kind of follow the same pattern. Given a path that matches in the URL, I want to render a component named home. And you can give that component just a standard name that means something to you. Or if the path is about, let's go load the about component. What I love about the about component is that that's probably not a component people are going to use often. Like home, everyone's going to hit home. So let's just make sure that loads as quickly as possible. When the page renders, home is available and ready to go. But the about components might not be used that often. So let's go load that one asynchronously. So this syntax here of using the Lambda instead of just using a component tells Vue that if it needs the about page, it should go load it on demand at that point. But if it doesn't need it, it never goes and gets it. And then we configure the Vue router, tell it, all right, here's my list of routes. Everything is good to go. So I kind of already answered this question. Does Vue download all the components when a page renders? And yes, pretty much, unless you set up lazy loading. And that's what I just talked about. If you have components that rely on other components, if you're not lazy loading them, like the example here on the screen, they will all get pulled down with that initial index.html load. And that's good and bad. I mean, Vue payloads are pretty small to begin with, but you know how developers are. They can take nice, easy, simple things and make them super complex. It's why we used to have 10 megabyte Vue states in ASP.NET web forms. So if you absolutely know that you're not going to need a component all the time, every time, use lazy loading and let Vue handle when it eventually gets downloaded. And use this other trick as well. So I have the comments for Webpack chunk name. I tend to give all my different components their own chunk name because it helps Webpack optimize files, specifically for file size. So if I have a bunch of components that are related and they're usually all used together, I'll put them all in the same chunk. And so when they get compiled and optimized, they're all in the same file and they get downloaded at the same time versus having all these smaller individual files. That's a thing I do. Let's talk a little bit more about what makes a Vue component a Vue component. So I showed one way earlier. That was a single file component, but there are multiple ways to build Vue components. I tend to like the single file component framework because it's just the easiest to understand. HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And you put all these together, Vue will figure the rest out. And these are really easy to use and just and also you'll hit points where you're like, maybe I should make this snippet of code its own component. Well, it's easy enough to create a new one. And there's actually extensions for VS Code and for Visual Studio and other editors that will just scaffold 90% of this for you. So you can just start adding your own little snippets. But that's the important thing. This one file contains all of our HTML, our CSS, and our scripts. Let's talk about the development experience. Once you've built your VueJS app and you've built your basic ASP.NET Core app, how do you start this development experience? And this is where I've really gone back and forth on a lot of things, and I've kind of come to this conclusion. You have your browser. Your browser goes through your local network, and it talks to ASP.NET Core, and it's running on a port. So 14500. ASP.NET Core picks a random one every time. But you also have this VueJS app, which is running in development mode on its own port, 8080 or 8081 or so on. But I need the two to work together. That's a bit of a problem, which we'll come back to. But then in production, it's a little bit simpler because we'll do a production build of our VueJS app, and we'll deploy that along with ASP.NET Core. And this is the most common way that I've seen production builds done. Your browser still goes through the network, the magical internet, and it calls into your ASP.NET Core backend, but it's just one application. And let's say it's just asking for slash, so the default route. Well, ASP.NET Core is going to go into its www root folder, which is all just static, available to the internet files. It's going to pull out index.html and send that back to the browser. The browser will load that and then say, oh, here's all this JavaScript that I need, make subsequent requests back to ASP.NET Core, asking for different JavaScript or CSS files. And they're all served out of www root in the ASP.NET Core app. Now, you don't have to do it this way. You could take that compiled Vue.js app, put it in blob storage, put it in the new Azure static sites. It doesn't have to live in ASP.NET Core, but 95% of the time, this is what I see devs doing, because this is as close to how we used to do it with web forms and with Razor as you can get. All right. Let's talk more about development mode for a moment, because we had a problem. We had our ASP.NET Core app at one URL, and then we have our Vue.js app at another URL. And that's a problem, especially if you're trying to build API calls. What if the Vue.js app just wants to make a call to a path, which would represent your API, and it's on a different domain? So technically, it's a different domain because it's a different port. Well, that's a problem. And you got to build in the infrastructure to handle the host name, qualification, all that good stuff. What if there was a simpler way? So this is what we ended up doing. We have our browser, it talks to our network, and no matter what, we always talk to the ASP.NET Core backend at port whatever. And even for our client-side apps, we say every request that ASP.NET Core cannot handle, instead of returning a 404, it proxies that call to our Vue.js app, because most likely our Vue.js app can handle that request as well. So we set up this system, and it's called a proxy. You can also do the reverse or the alternate. You could proxy calls from Vue.js to ASP.NET Core that don't match. I've done it both ways. I see this as the easiest, less likely to screw up during development way of handling it, but it's whatever you want to do. We accomplished this with a not very well documented NuGet package called spa-services.extensions. So you have spa services, which is getting deprecated, but spa services extensions is still somewhat managed or maintained. This could probably go away in a couple of releases of ASP.NET Core. If it does, I need to figure out what I'm going to do. But at the moment, this works fine with ASP.NET 3.1. I haven't tested it with .NET 5 yet, so I don't know. But in our ASP.NET Core applications, we just say, I want to add spa static files and tell it, I'm going to tell it two things. Well, actually, I'm going to tell it one thing here. Then in the next function, I'll tell it something else. I'm going to tell spa services if I need any static files for that aren't handled by ASP.NET Core, it needs to go look in the www root. So this is doing use default files and use static files, if you've ever used those before in ASP.NET Core. But it's adding a it's just adding a little syntactic sugar around it. So it's not doing anything more spectacular. The real key is in configure, where you want to use SPA static files and then use SPA. So what we do here is we tell ASP.NET Core, let's say I'm in production. Production's easy. If it's in production, it's just going to serve stuff up out of www root. And this also prevents it from ever returning a 404. So if you need ASP.NET Core to return 404s for any reason, you're going to have to go in a different direction. In our cases, that's not a big deal. But we also need to handle the development experience. Development experience just says if we're in development mode, instead of serving out of www root, we should proxy the call or send the request over to our SPA development server. Now, I have it hard-coded here because that URL usually doesn't change. But if for some reason it changes on yours, you might want to have it as configuration. So this works really well. I have two applications running at the same time, my front end and my back end. So front end runs, and it's loading the VueJS app. Notice it's on the VueJS. It's running on the ASP.NET Core port because this whole system is working. We're coming in through development mode. We're asking for just empty route. So normally it would return index.html, right? Because that's a default file. Now that default file doesn't exist in www root, so it proxies the call to our SPA services server and gives us our app. So now everything's running under one URL, but I'm technically running two different apps under the one URL. This is all fine and well until you want to get into deployment. So Kevin, how do you deploy? Well, this is a multi-step process, and this is why we have build systems, right? Step one, you need to build the VueJS app. So npm run build takes care of that. It creates all the JavaScript and CSS and the index.html file that you need. And that's dropped into a folder called distribution. You take that folder, everything inside of it, and that needs to go into your www root at deployment time. Usually you can have a build script that does that for you. Yep, you leave all this. I don't know why I have this slide in here, but oh well. So as long as your files are in www root, when you deploy this to a production server, when SPA is running, it's not going to use the development proxy anymore. It's just going to serve out of www root, and all your files in there can get served up to the internet as they need to. One little optimization I make with Vue, just to save me a build step, is that in my Vue config, so you can set all kinds of options in here, but there's one in particular called output directory, and we set that to the path of our www root. So during an npm run build, we just copy all the output files directly to www root. That saves us a copy step, and I think that's just an optimization. So that's a little trick. So let's move a little bit further. Actually, let me look at questions. Is SPA services actually pulling the Vue files from a second website, or is it returning 304 redirect and letting the browser pull it in? It is actually serving it up. So all the proxying is happening on the back end of your ASP.NET Core app. It's not making, it's not returning a redirect and making the browser do the work. The ASP.NET Core app is doing the work for you. So really good question. And Darwin's using Yarn at your prior job. Most new stuff, you just use npm. Yeah, not sold on the jump. I need to talk to a purist and say, why should I use Yarn? Because I haven't really had any issues with npm lately, but that's just me. Let's get more into the nuts and bolts of a SPA. When your Vue.js app is running, it's no good without data. How do you get data from your ASP.NET Core app? This is where I introduce Axios, because Vue.js does not have its own Ajax or HTTP client built into it. You need to do that work. you can remember, Vue is not opinionated at all. So it does not care how you get the data. And you could just build something like fetch that's built into the browser. Hopefully, maybe, knock on wood. I use Axios. A lot of folks in the Vue community use Axios. I also see a lot of folks in React using Axios as well, because it just makes it really simple to make requests to an endpoint, pass in data, get that data back, and handle errors and success conditions. But if you're only supporting new browsers, Fetch is fine. Although I would say Fetch is a little bit harder to use than Axios. What does Axios look like? Anyone remember jQuery Ajax? It looks very similar to that. So Axios, this is just a simple GET request to an API endpoint. And there's two conditions. There's a success condition, which is any 200 response. Then there are error conditions, which are 400 or 500 levels responses. I'm using callback syntax, but this also supports async await in JavaScript, if that's something you'd rather use. The number one question I get when talking about SPAs is, how do you handle state between different components? And let's talk about this process a little bit. Every component on the screen itself has a state, and you might have components, higher level parent components that might own some sort of global state. Let's say a list of users or a list of products, and it needs to pass that state down to child components, because the child components might need to do something with it. Or you might have component A needs a list of products, but then component B needs a list of products as well. Well, do you need two components both making the API calls to get a list of products? Or is there a way that they could share that state between the two of them? Well, yes. You could, instead of just having component A and component B getting the data themselves, you could have the parent component get the data and then share it amongst the two. I have discovered that, and this is how you pass things down through properties. I've discovered that with a more robust application, this gets really cumbersome. Just building in all these different levels of state management. So the parent component passes it down to child. Child passes something down to its child, and so on and so on. I think it's really well for data that's going downstream. But what if a component 2 or 3 layers down needs to make a change to the data at the top level? Well, now you have to worry about emitting events that pass back up the tree to that global state so something can change. And there's just a lot of cases where it doesn't work, or you think it should work and it doesn't because of some little detail in Vue. You can run into a bunch of issues. I like component-based state for very simple things that are just for that component and maybe one child down. For anything that I need to manage large data objects across multiple components, I tend to use Vuex. It's a global state management tool. It takes you a little bit to understand how it's supposed to work. So if you don't understand it from these slides, don't worry. It's really something you have to get in and develop against to fully understand. What Vuex does is it takes state management and pulls it out of the components and manages it centrally. So then any component can say, I need this data or I need that data. And Vuex will give it to the components. Well, then there are actions that can say, go talk to APIs, get new data that comes in. I have Vuex actions that listen to WebSocket calls, or they'll listen to other events that happen in the browser. And then when these actions occur, they execute these functions called mutations that actually change the data. And when the mutations occur, any component that was using this data in the application, they get a notification that things have changed and your state of your page can update. that is a very simplistic overview of what Vuex does. Maybe this is a little bit easier. You have your Vue.js app. You use Vuex. Vuex manages the global state of the application. Actions execute to do different things. Maybe it's checking some logic. Maybe it's going to an API. Maybe it's I don't know, getting information from a user. Mutations take the results of those actions and change the state. So it becomes this circular effect of you have your state, you execute actions that run mutations on the data, and the data changes. So, all right, cover this. The state is available to any object that wants it. So if so this is my global state. Global state can take any form, just regular objects. You can have simple types like numbers and strings. You can have arrays. Vuex will manage all these items for you. And then when you need to change something, you run what's called a mutation. So a mutation might be, I make that Axios call. Well, on success, I need to change the state with the data that I just received. If I have an error, that might be something else I put into global state, saying, all right, well, this particular call had an error. Anyone that needs to know about this error is now aware of it. So these state changes then go off and get reflected in the global state. So, oh, I skipped this step. So, all right, sorry. So how do you call a mutation? So how do you tell the app that something needs to happen? This happens inside of an action. So if we take that Axios call from earlier, making a call to our API, well, there are two responses there, success or error. Well, you can't just call a function. What you do is you call this thing called commit from Vuex. You can tell Vuex, all right, I need to run the load user success mutation, or I need to load the load user's error mutation. And you can pass in some metadata. That metadata then gets sent onto the mutation. So where it gives you the global state that Vuex is managing, and then whatever data was passed in along. So you can change the state any way you wish here. And you can only change the state inside of a mutation. Once that happens, any component that is mapping to that state. So here's an example of I have a Vue single file component. It is mapping to the global state for users and some number, or for, users and global number. But I can tell Vuex, I want to get and manage state of users and global number, but I want to call them something differently locally. So users and some number instead of global number, because. So these just act as regular pieces of data inside of my component. And as you can see on line 5, I can iterate over that array of users as much as I want to. The key here is if something changes to users through a mutation, this component will automatically re-render itself with the new data. I don't have to write any other hooks other than map state. But what's going to kick off the call to the actions? Well, that's done by the individual components as well. Not only can I map state, but I can map actions in components. And what that means is I can tell this Vue component, there's an action in Vuex called load users. So that makes it accessible to my Vue component. So this component loads, I can capture a created event or an event when the component is loaded. It can even be a button click for all purposes. I can call into Vuex through the load users method, and that kicks off the action to make the Axios call to our API. The API returns success or failure, which then calls into a Vuex mutation. The mutation changes the data, the components re-render. And I know that is a really, this is an entire session all on its own. But this is just a general idea of Vuex in a nutshell. All right. Questions. React community calls is prop passing to children prop drilling. Yeah. RxJS. Yep. Redux, now Vue, Vuex, all basically the same thing. Global state management. Yeah, exactly right. It's different ways to skin a cat. But remember, Vue doesn't have an opinion, so Vuex isn't technically a part of the Vue install. You have to elect into that separately. But what's nice is if there's another state management library you want to use, just drop it into Vue, and you could use that yourself. It might take a little bit more heavy lifting if it's not if there's not already a library built to do that. But you don't have to use Vuex. I only show Vuex because it's the official state management platform for Vue. All right. Last common question is about authentication, because when you serve up these apps, you're basically serving up just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. How do you make sure that people are authenticated to make calls in the backend that actually have vital data in it? There's two ways to really do authentication in a Vue in a single page app. Cookie authentication, which we are used to. That is just how the web was built. Works really well when you're working with same domain systems, because a cookie from a domain works for any call to that domain. Very well supported. The built-in support in ASP.NET Core Identity, this just works. It's not broken. It's also sent automatically unless you tell it not to. So the browser makes an API request to an endpoint. It sends the cookie along with it. So your endpoint can read the cookie, process the data, and either allow or disallow the call. And cookies are pretty easy to revoke, where if you're on the back end and someone's not allowed in the system anymore, you revoke their access. Well, the cookie gets checked on the call. Well, if they're not allowed in, the call fails. They get like a 403 forbidden or something. The other way, and this is the new hotness, as I call it, are JWTs, or JSON Web Tokens. It's something new. They're not necessarily more or less secure than cookies at the moment, even though I know there's new iterations on JWTs happening all the time, but it's all JSON based. So where a cookie is just kind of like a plain text representation, JWTs are encrypted JSON objects. And when I say encrypted, I mean encrypted. You can take any JWT or run it through a tool and get the JWT data out of it. The key is that there are the way that JWT is encrypted, that it has keys inside of it that are cross-checked with keys on the server. So only the server that issues the JWT should be able to authenticate the JWT. I'm really simplifying that, and I don't mean to. They're also not sent to the server by default. So you have to build in the functionality for your API calls to make sure that if you have a JWT to send to an authenticated endpoint, well, you need to include that JWT, usually through a header or such. And currently, in ASP.NET Core, there's support for JWTs. There's no support built in for refresh or revoking tokens, so you have to manage that yourself. I've written that code at least 3 times, and so Rob's saying they aren't encrypted. There's not. Yes, I think we're. It's just base. So I said encrypted. I meant encoded. You're absolutely right. Which, I mean, encoding is it's a bad form of encryption. Basically, it's not going to be a plain string you're reading. You have to run it through a process to get the plain string out of it. So ASP.NET Core refresh and revoking tokens, which I think are critical aspects of using JWTs, not fully supported by identity at the moment. But that is stuff they are iterating on all the time. So the last time I wrote identity for JWTs was ASP.NET Core 2.2. And I did some subtle checks when 3.1 came out. So something's probably changed, and I'm just not aware of it yet. But all the code we have in production still works perfectly fine. The last big thing is don't confuse authentication with authorization. This is this comes up commonly. When you deliver HTML, that stuff shouldn't go through an authentication process. You're just dumping out HTML and JavaScript and CSS. As soon as the client needs something, it needs to send a request to the server saying, I need the list of users, I need the list of products. But it's up to the server to take that JWT or that cookie and go, all right, are you allowed to do this? And ASP.NET Identity handles 99% of that for you. So make sure that the server is checking and double checking that a person is able to perform a function that they're asking to do. The server is always a single point of truth. When I build spas can send down business logic, and it's all hidden away in cryptic JavaScript code, and usually multiple files. But we never send down data as part of a spa because we consider the spa, so the box is just Vue.js. That is all just public. It can be loaded on any machine. It's the data that's important. Because the big question that comes up from folks is, well, how do I protect like my add user screen or my edit user screen? It's like, well, from a Vue standpoint, you don't. You serve up the HTML to render that content, but that the view itself is useless without the data behind it or the ability to send the request to the server. Protect your server. The facade that you enter the data in is worthless. So here's my example of using authorize on a controller. So I wish I had time to go into ASP.NET Identity. That's pretty straightforward to turn on, and just go to your controllers, go to your actions, and set authorization. It's almost easy to just authorize everything out of the box and tell ASP.NET Core, all right, I don't need authentication on this particular call. So authenticate everything, authorize everything, and go to special calls and say, all right, well, my home controller does not need authentication. Anyone can call this call. All right. Number 4 on this one is handle your errors. This actually should be its own section. Because we're dealing with APIs, we're dealing with spas, it is very easy when you're developing to get lazy and always assume that you're going to have success clauses. Go back to my Axios call. If I always assumed that it was success, what happens in that 1% of cases where there's an error? I need to make sure I handle those errors, show a message or something to a user. If not, you're just going to have very frustrated users in the long run. Same thing with authentication. If this call to get has a 403, I should tell the person you don't have access to this. So handle your errors. All right. I have a GitHub repo, sample spa, Vue.js, ASP.NET Core. There's actually this demo end to end. You should be able to just pull it down and run it, both sides of the story. So, but with that, I am done talking. I'm right at my hour. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Let me go back to my button. There we go. Can I put the app repo in the chat? Yes, I can. All right, so I'll drop both of these. So this, and actually the app repo is not on my site yet. Let's get 72 slides. There we go. All right, and there's the, I don't know why I put the special character in there. All right, and Darn spaces. Sorry about that, folks. Darwin, are you at all familiar with the Quasar framework for Vue? And if so, do you have an opinion on Vuetify versus Quasar? I do not. Let me. You can't just search for Quasar because it's like, oh, you mean Quasar? Let's go take a look. Build high performance Vue.js user interfaces in record time. Nope, no opinion. Have never looked at this before, but that's not surprising. There's a lot of stuff up there I've never heard of before. So let's just look at I need some sample code. Show me some sample code and we'll be good. All the documentation looks exactly the same. Getting started. No. I just need examples. I need examples. Show me examples. Let's start here. All right. Yeah, I'd have to spend more time with this. So I'm not quite sure. Never used it before. Can you share the ASP.NET Core refresh JWT code? I don't have that anywhere at the moment to share. I'll add that to my to-do list. That is actually what I really want to do. I want to do two things. I need to revisit ASP.NET Core 3.1 identity and see if they've added anything around that. I don't think they have. I don't think that's been a priority for them right now. The other thing is look at something like Identity Server. That's supposed to do all that out of the box. I have not given my due diligence to Identity Server like I should have. Evan, is it a bad idea to pull authorization claims from the app's database and use session storage to store check claims per client app route? Do you have any content on protecting API calls from using third-party authentication services? So the second question, I do not. All right, so let's talk about that first question. So normally what we'll do, so when your app loads, you'll either redirect them to some sort of login page. So you'll go through some sort of authentication process. Once you get the JWT, what you can do in the JWT is you can list the claims that the person has access to. What we'll do is we will actually cache those in session storage. So the claims that the JWT says I have, I will track those. And what that does is that gives the person UI access. The reason we cache those is it's difficult and you probably shouldn't do it, as when you want to do authentication checks on routes, you don't want anything asynchronous in there. You kind of want to make that as quick as possible. I'm not even sure if you can do it in Vue Router. I'm trying to remember now. It's been such a long time since I've looked at that code. I don't think you can do asynchronous checks. So I don't think there's a mechanism in there where if I need to go to the create user screen, that I can ask the server, do I have rights to do this? And do that asynchronously and then tell Vuex, yes, allow the route or don't allow the route. We handle that error, and I don't remember how we handle that situation. I don't remember how we handle that situation. I think we cache the claims, because the worst case there is you let them see the screen, and then if they try to then call the endpoint to add a user, well, your server should go, this JWT is not allowed to create users. 403 forbidden. So you know, I wish it would take me too long to go pull that code up because I'm not quite sure. But I don't think it's bad to cache that stuff, because even so, if your JWT initially says this is what we're allowed to do, you can, I mean, even so, you make those calls, it's still the server is going to tell you, yes, you can make this call. No, you can't make that call. So this is what, yeah, Rob, that's basically the same thing I'm saying. So yeah, I didn't go that deep into the Vue router, but yeah, they're called route guards. So for any route change that happens, you can tell Vue, should this route change happen, or should I allow this to occur? So you can do a quick check to say, let me check the claims that I know about. So what we do for our app, the last app I did that in, it was just simple. You're either an administrator or you're not. And so if you have a claim that's administrator, I think what we do is just a quick session check to say, did they have an administrative claim? If they do, we let them see the screen. But the first step on the screen when it loads is, let's go get the data for administrators, and you have to provide your JWT. And if you're not really an administrator, you don't get the data. It's just a blank screen. It doesn't do anything. So thanks, Evan. And thanks everyone for showing up, and everyone who's still hanging out here. Seth, appreciate it. All right, friends. Well, I don't even really know where there is to go hang out now. So if anyone had any other questions, so, all right. Well, see you around. Take care, Edward. Appreciate it. All right. Well, I'm going to turn off my screen, and I'm going to leave. All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the rest of Code PaLOUsa.